In Southern California, where sunshine paints the coast and quiet suburbs feel safe, a dark story was slowly taking shape, one built on fear, obsession, and a divorce so toxic it would eventually ignite a murder plot that stunned the entire country. This isn't the story of strangers colliding by accident. It's the story of a former model turned fitness instructor, Diana Lovejoy, whose perfect on-camera smile hid a storm that had been building for years. And at the center of that storm was her ex-husband, Greg Mulvihill, a quiet engineer, a steady man, and someone who never imagined that the woman he once loved would eventually try to have him killed. To understand how their marriage transformed from love to attempted murder, we have to go back, before the courtrooms, before the custody battles, before police officers followed footprints in the dirt on a dark road. Back to a time when Greg and Diana were the couple people admired. They met in the early 2000s, both living in Carlsbad, California. Diana was striking, photogenic, athletic, and always upbeat. Greg was the opposite in many ways, calm, grounded, analytical. At first, they balanced each other. Friends said they looked like a couple from a lifestyle ad. Diana's dream was simple: a beautiful marriage, a healthy life, and a family she could pour herself into. But behind the smiles, there were cracks forming early. Diana lived through childhood trauma, and the scars never fully healed. She also struggled with health issues that took a toll on her emotionally. Greg tried to be supportive, but slowly the marriage began to strain under the weight of mistrust, stress, and miscommunication. Infertility challenges only deepened the divide, turning their once romantic home into a place of blame and resentment. Eventually, after years of trying therapy, trying to hold things together, and trying to be the perfect couple people assumed they were, the marriage fell apart. What followed wasn't a normal separation. It was a bitter, draining, and explosive break that would drag both of them into one of Southern California's most bizarre attempted murder cases. When the divorce began, Diana's emotions spiraled. She accused Greg of abuse, manipulation, and cruelty. Greg denied all of it. Every accusation became a weapon. Every court hearing became another small war. Their love story had transformed into a battlefield. By the time custody negotiations for their young son began, both sides had built walls so high that communication barely existed. Diana believed she had lost control over her life, and instead of accepting the collapse of their marriage, she convinced herself that Greg was the source of all her suffering. In her mind, removing Greg wasn't a crime, it was justice. This is where a key figure enters the story: Weldon McDavid Jr., a military veteran and firearms instructor who worked at a local shooting range. He was disciplined, intense, and someone who viewed himself as a protector. Diana signed up for shooting lessons during a period when she felt vulnerable and afraid, and Weldon saw himself as someone who could save her. Their connection wasn't romantic, it was psychological. Diana needed someone who believed her story of victimhood. Weldon needed someone who needed him. And as the divorce became brutal, Weldon's role grew from instructor to advisor, then to confidant, and eventually to something far more dangerous. Police would later say that Weldon developed an unhealthy, almost obsessive loyalty towards Diana, one that convinced him he was doing something noble, even heroic, by stepping into her personal war. Diana, overwhelmed with fear and resentment, leaned heavily on him. She shared every detail of her divorce, every accusation, every court battle. And Weldon began to paint Greg in his mind as a threat, a villain who needed to be handled. The moment everything shifted was when a mysterious phone call was made to Greg on the night of September 1st, 2016. The voice on the other end said he had evidence that would help him in the custody battle: a flash drive containing damaging information about Diana. Greg was told to meet at a remote dirt road near Rancho Santa Fe to pick it up privately. Anyone else might have ignored the call, but Greg wanted to protect his son, and he knew how messy the divorce had become. So he agreed. He didn't go alone, though. He brought his friend, Jason, a man who sensed something wasn't right. They drove through the dark, dusty road, guided only by faint GPS coordinates and the beams of their headlights. When Greg stepped out of the car, he wasn't met by a stranger with evidence. Instead, a sudden burst of gunfire ripped through the night. A single bullet shot through Greg's torso, narrowly missing his heart. Jason dragged him back into the car as he screamed in pain, and the two sped off, calling 911 while Greg tried to hold himself together. Greg survived that night by inches, and as police arrived on the scene, they began piecing together the puzzle. Tire tracks in the dirt, footprints belonging to someone trained to move silently. The shooter wasn't a random attacker. It was someone who knew what they were doing, someone tactical, someone professional. Investigators worked backwards from the crime scene, tracing calls, text messages, and every unusual detail from the days leading up to the ambush. And slowly, a horrifying picture began to form. The person behind the plan wasn't a stranger hiding in the shadows. It was Greg's ex-wife. Detectives began focusing on two suspects, Diana Lovejoy and her shooting instructor, Weldon McDavid. Phone records, location data, and testimony all pointed them in the same direction. And while Diana tried to appear innocent, shocked, fragile, confused, her digital trail told another story. But the strongest moment in the investigation came when detectives brought Weldon into questioning. They didn't have a full confession, but they had enough evidence to corner him psychologically, and eventually he broke down. He admitted being present that night, but he insisted he never meant to kill Greg. He claimed the shooting was supposed to scare him. That statement would become the foundation for the prosecution's argument. Fear turned into obsession, and obsession turned into attempted murder. When police arrested Diana, she maintained her innocence. She claimed she never planned a killing, never approved violence, and never knew Weldon would take things so far. But her calm exterior shattered in the courtroom months later, when the guilty verdict was read aloud. And in a moment that became viral nationwide, Diana collapsed, fainting dramatically as the reality of her sentence hit her. But before the world saw that collapse, before the courtroom gasps, the headlines, and the documentaries, there was a slow-burning fuse, a fuse made of resentment, fear, heartbreak, and denial. A fuse that led a fitness instructor from picture-perfect suburban life to a murder plot in the dark. The investigation into the attempted murder of Greg Mulvihill began in the dark, lonely hills of Carlsbad on the night of September 1st, 2016. But by the time detectives finished retracing every detail, they would uncover a conspiracy that felt almost cinematic in its precision and shockingly personal in its motivation. What started as a custody dispute had now escalated into a cold-blooded murder plot, and investigators were determined to expose every layer of it. When officers arrived at the crime scene that night, Greg was still shaken, standing beside his friend Jason, both men breathing heavily, their eyes darting toward the shadows of the brush. Greg kept repeating the same sentence, "Someone tried to kill me. Someone really tried to kill me." The wound on his torso was minor, a graze, not a deep penetration, but the adrenaline running through his body made him feel like he had just come out of a war zone. Jason told detectives that everything had happened too fast. He said, "We heard something like rustling, then suddenly a flashlight, like someone was aiming at us, and right after that, a gunshot." Detectives used their own flashlights to scan the hillside. The narrow dirt path where Greg had been lured looked like the perfect ambush site. No streetlights, no houses, and thick brush that could hide a person even at close range. The trail was steep on the left and sloped downward on the right. Anyone lying prone in the brush would have had a perfect angle for a shot. But one detail disturbed investigators the most. The shooter had used a tactical flashlight attached to the gun. This was not the behavior of a novice. Whoever pulled the trigger had training, possibly military, security, or law enforcement experience. This was someone who understood weapon handling and low-light targeting. After paramedics finished checking Greg, detectives separated him for a formal statement. Greg, still trembling, explained that earlier that evening he had received a phone call from a man claiming to be a private investigator. The caller said he had confidential documents related to Greg's custody battle with his ex-wife, Diana Lovejoy. The PI insisted that Greg pick up the documents in person at a specific location in the hills. Greg thought the timing was odd, but the custody fight had become unpredictable, and he didn't want to ignore anything that could impact his son. So he went, cautiously, and with his friend Jason for backup. The moment detectives heard this, they exchanged looks. It sounded like a setup. A fake PI call? A remote meeting spot and then an ambush from the shadows? This was clearly pre-planned. But by whom? Greg didn't take long to answer that question. Almost immediately, he said, "Diana. It has to be Diana." His voice wavered, not from anger, but from heartbreak. The divorce had been tense, but he never imagined she would do something this dangerous. Detectives didn't jump to conclusions, but they also didn't ignore the possibility. They asked Greg to recount recent conflicts. That's when a toxic history unfolded. Restraining orders, allegations, arguments over custody, accusations that were never fully resolved. It was clear that the relationship had deteriorated beyond repair, and that Diana had grown increasingly hostile. With that information, detectives went from the crime scene straight to the Carlsbad Police Department to map out a plan. They brought in their digital forensics team, firearms experts, and investigators trained in behavioral threat assessment. Within hours, they had built an initial profile of their primary suspect, the shooter. According to the trajectory and precision of the shot, investigators concluded that the gunman was not improvising. The angle of the bullet indicated that the shooter had gone prone, belly to the ground, which is a tactical shooting position used almost exclusively by trained marksmen. A normal civilian wouldn't know to do that, nor would they attach a tactical light to a weapon for a nighttime ambush unless they had practiced it before. So investigators began asking, did Diana have any connection to someone with tactical firearms training? The answer came quickly and unexpectedly. One of the detectives working the case checked into Diana's background, her employment history, her associates, her known acquaintances. That's when they discovered she had been attending shooting lessons at a local gun range. The range, in turn, was known for employing specialized instructors, including former military and trained tactical shooters. When they checked the roster of instructors, one name immediately stood out: Weldon McDavid Jr., a Marine veteran, a firearms expert, a tactical shooting instructor. Every detail of the ambush pointed directly towards someone with his skill set. Before approaching Weldon, detectives pulled surveillance footage from the gun range. There they found exactly what they feared. Diana and Weldon had spent a lot of time together, far more than normal student-instructor interactions. They trained after hours, they practiced private drills, and they frequently left the range at the same time. There were even recordings showing them speaking closely, sharing private moments, almost like a confidant relationship rather than a professional one. To investigators, this wasn't proof, but it was a serious indicator of collaboration. Next, detectives subpoenaed phone records. When the logs came in, the evidence became even more troubling. In the weeks leading up to the attack, Diana and Weldon had exchanged an unusually high volume of messages and calls, some lasting over an hour, often late at night. Many of the calls took place shortly after confrontations between Diana and Greg regarding custody. The pattern was undeniable. Each argument, each escalation, was followed by communication with Weldon. At this point, investigators brought them both in, separately, for questioning. Diana's interview was calm, almost rehearsed. She denied everything. She claimed she had nothing to do with the attack, insisted she had been at home, and described Weldon as just a friend. She even tried to paint Greg as unstable, an attempt to undermine his credibility. But detectives noticed something subtle. Whenever they asked about her relationship with Weldon, her voice changed. She hesitated. Her eye contact broke. It was a classic indicator of emotional connection or guilt. Weldon's interview was a very different story. He was composed, polite, respectful, exactly what you'd expect from someone with a strong law enforcement background. But beneath that calm exterior, detectives sensed tension. When asked if he knew anything about the shooting, Weldon said no. When asked if he owned tactical firearms, he admitted yes, because it was part of his job. But when detectives asked about the night of the attack, his answers became vague. He couldn't clearly account for his exact location or movements. Investigators pressed him. Did he make a call pretending to be a private investigator? Did he lure Greg to the trail? Did he fire the shot? Weldon denied everything, but investigators weren't convinced. The turning point came when investigators obtained cell phone tower data. The phone that had called Greg, the fake PI, was a prepaid burner phone. Hard to trace. But phone tower records showed something shocking. The burner phone had pinged in the same locations and at the same times as Weldon's personal phone for several days before the attack. They had traveled together, meaning someone using the burner phone was physically with Weldon during that time. That was the crack investigators needed. They obtained a search warrant for Weldon's home. The search revealed tactical gear consistent with the ambush: a rifle, a tactical flashlight, camouflage clothing, and spent casings matching the caliber of the round fired at Greg. But here was the detail that sealed Weldon's fate. The imprint of brush debris found on his clothing matched the exact terrain of the hillside where the ambush took place. It was almost as if the hillside had left a signature on him. With evidence stacking up, investigators turned back to Diana to see how deep her involvement went. Financial records showed that she had given Weldon several gifts over the months: money transfers, equipment purchases, even paying for shooting range fees. She also had internet searches linking her to custody-related legal panic, including how to win custody, how to deal with abusive ex, and how to get someone out of your life. Those searches may have been emotional, but in the context of the attack, they painted a darker picture. Prosecutors believe they now understood the full story. Diana, desperate to win custody and fueled by anxiety, anger, and resentment, confided in Weldon, a man she trusted, admired, and maybe saw as her protector. And Weldon, whether driven by misguided loyalty, infatuation, or a personal savior complex, agreed to help her. Together, they devised a plan to eliminate Greg permanently. The plan was detailed. They used a burner phone to prevent traceability. They selected a remote trail that would minimize witnesses. Weldon prepared his gear like a military operation: flashlight mounted, chamber checked, prone stance ready. The call was made to lure Greg into the ambush. And then once Greg showed up, Weldon executed the plan with the precision of a trained marksman. The only thing he didn't anticipate was Greg moving at the last moment, turning what should have been a fatal shot into a grazing wound. That tiny moment of chance saved Greg's life and destroyed the entire conspiracy. The trial of Diana Lovejoy and Weldon McDavid Jr. became one of the most shocking and talked about court cases in California, not just for the attempted murder itself, but for the unraveling of a conspiracy that rested on desperation, manipulation, misplaced loyalty, and a dramatic courtroom collapse that would later go viral around the world. When the investigation finally came together, prosecutors were confident they had exposed the truth. A fitness instructor, drowning in hatred for her ex-husband, had aligned herself with a trained marksman who believed he was acting as her protector. But the courtroom would reveal far more than the investigators expected, exposing the emotional depth, the psychological unraveling, and the ultimate downfall of two people trapped in a toxic bond of fear, fantasy, and fatal misjudgment. The trial opened with an atmosphere that felt electric. Media outlets gathered at the courthouse, reporters filled the hallways, and spectators lined up early each morning just to get a seat. This case had everything: marital conflict, a dramatic nighttime ambush, a secret alliance between a woman and her firearms instructor, and a shootout in the dark that barely missed becoming a homicide. The prosecution's opening statement was blunt, direct, and devastating. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not a misunderstanding. This was not self-defense. This was a planned, calculated assassination attempt on a father just trying to survive a custody dispute. And the woman who orchestrated it is sitting right there. The prosecutor pointed directly at Diana, whose expression remained neutral, almost frozen. She wore conservative clothing, glasses, and a calm persona, intentionally crafted to appear harmless. But her eyes, observers noted, seemed distant, as if she was bracing herself for the collapse of everything she had built. Then came Weldon McDavid, the former Marine, the firearms expert, the man whose tactical precision nearly ended Greg Mulvihill's life. He sat stiffly, posture perfect, face unreadable. While Diana looked nervous and tense, Weldon looked like he was back in a military briefing, emotionless and focused. The prosecution argued that Weldon wasn't just a hired gun. He was emotionally invested in Diana's problems, even infatuated with her. They described him as someone who wanted to be Diana's savior, someone who stepped into the role of protector so deeply that he was willing to kill for her. And as the evidence would soon show, that theory wasn't far from reality. The first major testimony came from Greg Mulvihill himself, the man who survived the attempted murder. Greg walked to the stand cautiously, still carrying the emotional weight of the ambush. His voice trembled at times as he described the night of the shooting. He recounted the phone call from the so-called private investigator, the strange instructions to meet on a dirt path after dark, and his unease that made him bring his Marine friend, Jason, along. He spoke about the sudden flash of light, the blast of the gunshot, and the moment he realized he'd been hit, followed by the chilling realization that someone genuinely wanted him dead. The courtroom listened in absolute silence. When Greg mentioned that he immediately suspected Diana, several jurors glanced at her, and she kept her head lowered. Then came law enforcement testimony. Detectives took the jury step by step through the investigation, revealing the burner phone that shadowed Weldon's personal phone, the gunshot trajectory analysis, the tactical gear found in Weldon's possession, and hours of security footage showing Diana and Weldon frequently meeting at the gun range. When prosecutors presented the cell tower evidence showing both phones traveling together, a visible shift swept across the jury. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. This was a pattern. But the most powerful evidence came from Weldon's interrogation video. In the recording, Weldon attempted to control his tone, but small cracks appeared as detectives pressed him harder. When asked where he was on the night of the shooting, his hesitation was glaring. When they brought up the burner phone, he shifted his body. And when they suggested Diana had manipulated him into committing the crime, he didn't immediately deny it. Instead, he paused, swallowed, and asked for clarification. That hesitation became one of the prosecutor's strongest moments. They argued that Weldon wasn't just loyal, he was emotionally compromised, willing to break the law to protect the woman he believed needed him. And whether Diana had outright asked him to kill Greg or simply manipulated him emotionally, the intent remained the same. Then came the digital evidence, Diana's internet searches, email history, and text messages. The prosecution framed her as a woman consumed by paranoia and anger. She searched terms like how to win custody disputes, how to protect your child from abusive ex, and emotionally charged articles about toxic relationships. But it was the communication with Weldon that cast the darkest shadow. The late-night texts, the emotionally vulnerable conversations, the sudden spikes in communication after every argument with Greg, all of it suggested a reliance on Weldon that went much deeper than friendship. The prosecution argued that Diana fed him a version of reality where she was the helpless victim and Greg was a dangerous threat. And Weldon, already inclined to protection due to his military background, absorbed that narrative until it pushed him toward violence. Diana's defense team tried to counter by portraying her as a frightened mother, manipulated by a man with more tactical knowledge and a savior complex. They claimed Diana only confided in Weldon for emotional support, and that Weldon acted alone, driven by his own delusions. They argued Diana never asked him to kill Greg, never intended violence, and had no idea Weldon was capable of such an attack. But prosecutors quickly dismantled that narrative by highlighting the burner phone's movements, the planning timeline, and the detailed coordination. The jury was shown how Diana and Weldon were in constant contact on the days leading to the ambush, and how their communication abruptly dropped immediately after the shooting. The silence after the attack, prosecutors argued, was not coincidence. It was guilt. Weldon's defense was even striking. His legal team attempted to argue that the shot was merely a warning shot, not an attempted murder. They portrayed it as an attempt to scare Greg away, not kill him. But ballistics experts shredded that claim. The prone position, the flashlight alignment, the trajectory, all of it indicated a kill shot aimed directly at Greg's torso. The only reason Greg survived was because he moved at the exact second the trigger was pulled. If he had remained still, the bullet would have pierced his heart. The prosecution called it what it was, a failed execution. As the trial continued, tension between Diana and Weldon became visible. They no longer made eye contact, their body language shifted. Diana leaned away, Weldon remained rigid and cold. The prosecution suggested something chilling. Their alliance had fractured the moment Weldon realized Diana might be distancing herself to save her own skin. This tension would soon erupt into one of the most unforgettable moments in courtroom history. After weeks of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom waited, reporters speculating on every detail. When the jury returned, the atmosphere turned silent. Weldon and Diana sat side by side, but miles apart emotionally. The judge read the verdict for Weldon first: guilty of attempted first-degree murder, guilty of assault with a deadly weapon. Weldon blinked but didn't flinch. His posture remained upright, military-like. It was as if he had expected this, or accepted it. Then came Diana's verdict. As the judge read, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, Diana's expression cracked for the first time. Her lips trembled, her breathing quickened, and before the judge completed the verdict, Diana suddenly collapsed in her chair, her body going limp, her head falling backward. A gasp erupted across the courtroom. Bailiffs rushed to her, nurses were called, and the entire room fell into chaos. Someone shouted, "She's fainted!" Cameras captured everything: the collapse, the scramble, the shock, and that clip would later circulate worldwide, becoming one of the most viral courtroom videos of the decade. But despite the collapse, the verdict stood. Diana was revived minutes later and escorted out of the courtroom, visibly shaken, crying softly as officers helped her stand. Weldon remained stoic, quietly speaking to his attorney before being led away in handcuffs. The judge later handed down their sentences. Weldon received 50 years to life for attempted murder. Diana received 26 years to life for her role in orchestrating the plot. The judge called their actions deliberate, cold, and disturbingly calculated. When the dust settled, Greg Mulvihill emerged from the courthouse holding the hand of the friend who had saved his life. In interviews later, Greg said he wasn't interested in revenge, only in closure and moving forward with his son. He said the attack changed him, but surviving it gave him a new appreciation for life. He said, "They tried to take me away from my child, but they failed, and justice won." The story of Diana Lovejoy and Weldon McDavid Jr. remains one of the most chilling custody-related crimes in modern American history, a real-life cautionary tale about the dangerous intersection of emotional manipulation, desperation, and the human capacity for violence when love and loyalty turn into obsession. And for two people who once believed they were acting out of love, the courtroom verdicts marked the final, irreversible collapse of their lives. A downfall sealed, not by fate, but by their own choices.